On the bitter morning of November 12, 1867, I discovered something that would haunt me for the rest of my days inside the crumbling walls of Thornfield Sanitarium in Millbrook, Maine. 82 bodies lay hidden beneath the floorboards, their remains telling a story of medical horror that the Wilson family had buried for 3 generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What started as a routine property inspection for the state of Maine became my descent into one of the most chilling medical scandals in American history. The Wilson dynasty had controlled Thornfield Sanitarium since 1834, promising miraculous cures for ailments that conventional medicine could not touch. Patients arrived hopeful and desperate, carrying life savings and family heirlooms to pay for treatments that Dr. Edmund Wilson claimed would restore their health completely. None of them ever returned home. For 33 years, the Wilson family convinced the world that their patients had been cured and relocated to Western territories for fresh starts. The truth was far more sinister. But first, let me take you back to November of 1867, when the first snow of winter began falling on the pine forests of central Maine, and when I stumbled upon evidence that would expose the most systematic case of medical murder in New England history. Millbrook, Maine was the kind of town that existed solely because of the lumber industry and the families who had grown wealthy from harvesting the endless forests that stretched north toward Canada. The town sat nestled between 2 rivers, with Main Street running parallel to the larger waterway that powered the sawmills and carried logs downstream to Portland. Most residents worked either in the mills or in businesses that supported the lumber trade, living modest lives in wooden houses that lined streets named after trees. The Wilson family stood apart from this working-class community like a cathedral among cabins. They had arrived in Millbrook in 1832, purchasing a sprawling estate on the hill overlooking the town center. Dr. Edmund Wilson claimed to be a graduate of Harvard Medical School, though no records from that institution ever confirmed his education. He spoke with the refined accent of Boston society and dressed in expensive suits that marked him as someone of considerable means and social standing. Within 2 years of his arrival, Dr. Wilson had constructed Thornfield Sanitarium, a 3-story brick building that dominated the hillside with its imposing facade and carefully manicured grounds. The sanitarium advertised treatments for consumption, nervous disorders, melancholia, and a dozen other conditions that plagued families throughout New England. Patients came from as far away as Boston and New York, drawn by testimonials and newspaper advertisements that promised revolutionary medical breakthroughs. Dr. Wilson claimed to practice a form of medicine that combined traditional European techniques with innovative American methods. He spoke confidently about mineral baths, electromagnetic therapy, and specialized dietary regimens that could cure diseases that had baffled other physicians. The sanitarium's literature described peaceful recovery rooms, nutritious meals, and compassionate care provided by trained medical staff under Dr. Wilson's personal supervision. The Wilson family presented themselves as pillars of the Millbrook community. Dr. Wilson served on the town council and contributed generously to the construction of the new Methodist church. His wife, Margaret Wilson, organized charitable events and supervised the ladies' auxiliary that provided aid to poor families during harsh winters. Their 3 children, Thomas, Catherine, and young Edmund Jr., attended the finest private schools and were expected to continue the family's medical legacy. Margaret Wilson was a tall, severe woman with graying hair that she wore pulled back in a tight bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She managed the sanitarium's daily operations with military precision, overseeing the kitchen staff, laundry workers, and groundskeepers who maintained the facility's pristine appearance. Patients and visitors alike found her intimidating, though. She spoke with the cultured vocabulary of someone educated in the finest finishing schools. Thomas Wilson, the eldest son, had returned from medical school in Philadelphia in 1865 to begin working alongside his father. At 28, he possessed the same commanding presence as Dr. Wilson, though his manner with patients was notably colder and more calculating. Staff members whispered that Thomas viewed patients as subjects for experimentation rather than human beings deserving of compassion and care. Catherine Wilson, 25 and unmarried, served as the Sanitarium's head nurse despite having no formal medical training. She moved through the wards with quiet efficiency, distributing medications and monitoring patients with the detached professionalism of someone who had learned to suppress natural human sympathy. Local women found her strange and unsettling, noting how she never attended social gatherings or showed interest in the normal pursuits of unmarried ladies her age. Young Edmund Jr., only 16 in 1867, was already showing signs of the family's peculiar relationship with medicine and death. He spent hours in the sanitarium's laboratory, studying anatomy texts and assisting with procedures that would have disturbed most children his age. Teachers at his private school noted his exceptional intelligence, but also remarked on his disturbing fascination with dissection and his complete lack of emotional response to suffering. The sanitarium employed approximately 20 staff members, including cooks, cleaners, groundskeepers, and orderlies who assisted with patient care. Most were local residents who appreciated the steady employment and decent wages that the Wilson family provided. They lived in small apartments in the sanitarium's basement or in cottages scattered around the property, forming a small community that existed entirely within the Wilson sphere of influence. Among the staff, 3 individuals would later prove crucial to understanding what really happened at Thornfield Sanitarium. Martha Collins, the head cook, had worked for the Wilson family since 1840 and had witnessed the arrival and disappearance of hundreds of patients over nearly 3 decades. James Murphy, the groundskeeper, maintained the extensive gardens and wooded areas surrounding the sanitarium, including several remote sections where the soil seemed unusually fertile and dark. Most important was Sarah Bennett, a young woman from Millbrook who had been hired as an assistant nurse in 1866. At 22, Sarah possessed the kind of natural curiosity and moral conscience that made her question practices that others accepted without thinking. She had grown increasingly disturbed by inconsistencies in patient records and the mysterious nighttime activities that seemed to occur regularly in the sanitarium's basement levels. The autumn of 1867 had been particularly busy at Thornfield Sanitarium. 14 new patients had arrived since September, bringing the total occupancy to its highest level in years. The patients represented a cross-section of New England society, from wealthy merchants seeking treatment for nervous exhaustion to working-class families who had scraped together every dollar to pay for medical care they believed would save their loved ones. Among the recent arrivals was Helen Richardson, a 40-year-old widow from Portland, whose consumption had resisted all conventional treatments. She had sold her late husband's business to afford 6 months at Thornfield, convinced that Dr. Wilson's revolutionary methods represented her last hope for recovery. Her letters home during the first weeks of treatment expressed optimism about her progress and gratitude for the Wilson family's personal attention to her case. Robert Hayes, a wealthy textile manufacturer from Lowell, Massachusetts, had brought his 19-year-old son, David, to Thornfield after the young man had suffered what physicians describe as a complete nervous breakdown. David had been a promising student at Harvard College until he began experiencing episodes of violent behavior alternating with periods of catatonic withdrawal. Traditional treatments had failed completely, leading the desperate father to invest his faith and fortune in Dr. Wilson's promises of miraculous recovery. The Morrison family had traveled from rural Vermont with their 12-year-old daughter Lucy, who suffered from seizures that had begun suddenly and seemed to worsen despite every medical intervention attempted. Lucy's parents, simple farming people who had never been more than 50 miles from their home, viewed Thornfield Sanitarium as their daughter's only chance for a normal life. They had mortgaged their farm to pay for her treatment, planning to rebuild their lives around whatever sacrifices her recovery might require. These patients and others like them had entered Thornfield Sanitarium with hope, trusting in the Wilson family's reputation and medical expertise. They had no way of knowing that they were walking into a carefully constructed trap that had been claiming lives for over 30 years. The truth about what happened to patients at Thornfield would not emerge until my investigation forced open doors that the Wilson family had kept locked since the sanitarium's founding. The warning signs had been accumulating for years, but the Wilson family's social standing and the isolated nature of their operation had protected them from serious scrutiny. Families occasionally inquired about relatives who had stopped writing letters, but Dr. Wilson always had reasonable explanations for these communication gaps. Patients were often moved to specialized facilities for advanced treatment, he explained, or they had recovered so completely that they chose to start new lives in Western territories, where their medical histories would not follow them. By November of 1867, however, the Wilson family's carefully maintained facade was beginning to show cracks that even their considerable influence could not conceal. The stage was set for revelations that would expose the true nature of Thornfield Sanitarium and the horrifying fate that had befallen the 82 patients whose bodies lay hidden beneath its floors. My investigation into the Wilson family began with a routine assignment from the Maine State Health Commission in early November 1867. The state had received anonymous letters questioning the operations at Thornfield Sanitarium, and as the newly appointed health inspector for Central Maine, I was tasked with conducting a comprehensive review of their medical practices and patient records. I had no idea that this simple bureaucratic duty would lead me into the darkest corners of medical depravity that New England had ever witnessed. The journey to Millbrook took me through dense pine forests that seemed to grow thicker and more oppressive with each mile. The November air carried the scent of snow and decaying leaves, while bare branches created skeletal patterns against the gray sky that stretched endlessly above the wilderness. When I finally crested the hill that led into town, Thornfield Sanitarium dominated the landscape like a fortress built to keep secrets rather than heal the sick. The building itself was an imposing structure of red brick and granite, 3 stories tall with wings extending from a central core that housed the main entrance and administrative offices. Tall windows lined each floor, but many were covered with heavy curtains that prevented anyone from seeing inside. The grounds were meticulously maintained, with graveled paths winding through gardens that had been prepared for winter dormancy. Everything about the place suggested wealth, order, and professional competence, exactly what desperate families would want to see when seeking medical miracles for their loved ones. Dr. Edmund Wilson greeted me personally at the front entrance, his manner combining professional courtesy with the subtle condescension that wealthy men often displayed toward government officials. He was a tall, lean man in his early 60s, with silver hair combed precisely and a well-trimmed beard that gave him the distinguished appearance expected of a prominent physician. His clothing was expensive but understated, and he wore a gold pocket watch that caught the light when he gestured during conversation. During our initial meeting in his private office, Dr. Wilson presented himself as a pioneer in medical science who had dedicated his life to treating patients that conventional medicine had abandoned as hopeless. He spoke eloquently about his innovative approaches to mental illness, consumption, and various chronic conditions that plagued the population of New England. His office walls were lined with medical texts in multiple languages, diplomas from prestigious institutions, and photographs of patients who had supposedly recovered completely under his care. The diplomas, I would later discover, were masterful forgeries created by a skilled craftsman in Boston, who specialized in producing false credentials for confidence men and fraudulent professionals. Dr. Wilson had never attended Harvard Medical School or any other legitimate medical institution. His medical knowledge came entirely from books he had studied independently and techniques he had observed during brief apprenticeships with rural physicians who had never questioned his background or qualifications. Margaret Wilson joined us for afternoon tea in the sanitarium's elegant reception room, where she presided over fine china and imported delicacies with the grace of a woman accustomed to entertaining distinguished guests. She spoke knowledgeably about the sanitarium's operations, describing the daily routines that patients followed and the various therapeutic activities that promoted their recovery. Her manner was warm but controlled, and she demonstrated the kind of detailed knowledge about individual patients that suggested genuine personal involvement in their care. What struck me most about Margaret Wilson was her remarkable memory for patient details and her ability to discuss even the most seriously ill individuals with optimism and confidence. She could recite treatment schedules, dietary requirements, and progress notes for dozens of patients without consulting any written records. This seemed impressive at first, but I would later realize that her perfect recall was possible only because she was recounting carefully rehearsed fiction rather than actual medical information. Thomas Wilson appeared during my second day at the sanitarium, having returned from what his father described as a medical conference in Boston, where the latest advances in psychiatric treatment had been discussed. Thomas was a younger version of his father, equally tall and distinguished, but with harder eyes and a manner that suggested impatience with social niceties. He spoke about patients in clinical terms that emphasized their pathologies rather than their humanity, referring to them as subjects for study rather than individuals deserving compassion. During our conversation about the sanitarium's approach to treating mental illness, Thomas revealed knowledge of surgical procedures and pharmaceutical compounds that seemed remarkably advanced for a rural Maine facility. He described experimental treatments involving precise brain surgery and chemical interventions that he claimed could permanently alter personality disorders and eliminate violent tendencies in dangerous patients. The casual way he discussed these radical procedures should have alarmed me more than it did at the time. Catherine Wilson managed the sanitarium's nursing staff with military efficiency, maintaining schedules and protocols that ensured smooth daily operations. She was an attractive woman who might have been considered beautiful, if not for the coldness in her eyes and the rigid way she held herself during all interactions. She dressed in practical clothing that allowed her to move quickly through the wards, and she carried a ring of keys that gave her access to every room in the facility. The nursing staff under Catherine's supervision consisted of 6 young women from Millbrook and surrounding towns, all of whom seemed genuinely dedicated to patient care. They spoke positively about their work and expressed admiration for the Wilson family's commitment to helping the most difficult medical cases. However, I noticed that none of these nurses had been employed at the sanitarium for more than 2 years, suggesting a high turnover rate that might indicate problems with working conditions or job satisfaction. Young Edmund Jr. was perhaps the most disturbing member of the Wilson family, despite his youth and apparently normal appearance. At 16, he possessed an adult's vocabulary and the kind of sophisticated knowledge about anatomy and pathology that suggested extensive private tutoring in medical subjects. He spent most of his time in the sanitarium's laboratory, where he conducted what he described as research into disease processes and treatment effectiveness. The laboratory itself was located in the basement of the main building, accessible only through a locked door that required Catherine Wilson's permission to enter. The room contained medical equipment that seemed far more advanced than what would typically be found in a rural sanitarium, including microscopes, chemical apparatus, and surgical instruments that gleamed with the sharp precision of tools designed for delicate work. Edmund Jr. moved through this environment with complete confidence, handling dangerous chemicals and sharp instruments with the casual competence of someone who had been working with such materials for years. The sanitarium's patient population during my visit consisted of 43 individuals ranging in age from 12 to 74, representing various social classes and geographic origins throughout New England. They were housed in comfortable rooms on the second and third floors of the main building, with common areas for meals and recreational activities that promoted social interaction among those well enough to participate. The facility appeared to provide excellent care with nutritious meals, clean linens, and attentive nursing supervision that addressed both physical and emotional needs. However, I began to notice disturbing patterns in the patient population that raised questions about the sanitarium's actual success rate. Nearly all of the current patients had arrived within the past 6 months, with very few long-term residents who could testify to the effectiveness of extended treatment. When I inquired about patients who had completed their recovery programs, the Wilson family provided glowing testimonials and forwarding addresses for individuals who had supposedly moved to Western territories to start new lives. The patient records maintained by the Wilson family were remarkably detailed and professionally organized, containing comprehensive medical histories, treatment plans, and progress notes that documented each individual's journey toward recovery. The handwriting was consistent and neat, suggesting that all records were maintained by the same person, despite being attributed to different medical staff members. The treatment descriptions were technically sophisticated and included references to advanced medical procedures that seemed beyond the capabilities of a small rural facility. Martha Collins, the head cook, had worked at Thornfield Sanitarium longer than any other staff member except the Wilson family themselves. She was a stout, middle-aged woman with graying hair and capable hands that could prepare meals for 50 people without apparent effort. Her kitchen was immaculate and well-organized, stocked with high-quality ingredients that allowed her to create nutritious and appetizing meals for patients with various dietary restrictions and medical requirements. During my conversations with Martha Collins, I sensed an underlying tension that she tried to conceal beneath professional competence and loyalty to her employers. She spoke positively about the Wilson family and praised their dedication to patient care, but her eyes occasionally revealed doubt or concern that contradicted her spoken words. When I asked about former patients who had recovered and left the sanitarium, she provided the same general responses that I had heard from the Wilson family, but with less conviction and enthusiasm. James Murphy, the groundskeeper, maintained the extensive property surrounding Thornfield Sanitarium with the pride of someone who genuinely loved working with plants and soil. He was a quiet man in his 50s who had emigrated from Ireland during the potato famine and had found steady employment with the Wilson family shortly after their arrival in Millbrook. His knowledge of horticulture was extensive, and the gardens around the sanitarium testified to his skill in creating beautiful and productive growing spaces. The grounds of Thornfield Sanitarium extended over nearly 200 acres, including formal gardens near the main building, vegetable plots that provided fresh produce for the kitchen, and extensive wooded areas that offered peaceful walking paths for patients strong enough to enjoy outdoor exercise. James Murphy had created a landscape that promoted healing and tranquility, with carefully chosen plants and trees that provided color and interest throughout the growing season. However, I noticed that certain areas of the property seemed to be off-limits to patients and most staff members. James Murphy became noticeably uncomfortable when I asked about the more remote sections of the woods, particularly a clearing about half a mile from the main building where the soil appeared unusually dark and fertile. He claimed that area was being prepared for expanded vegetable cultivation, but his explanation seemed rehearsed and unconvincing. Sarah Bennett, the young assistant nurse, represented a different type of employee than the others I had met at Thornfield Sanitarium. She had been raised in Millbrook and had known the Wilson family by reputation throughout her childhood, but her direct experience working for them had lasted only 14 months. She was intelligent and observant, with the kind of natural curiosity that made her an excellent nurse, but also led her to ask questions that might make her superiors uncomfortable. Unlike the other staff members, Sarah Bennett seemed genuinely troubled by aspects of the sanitarium's operations that she could not fully understand or explain. She mentioned inconsistencies in patient records, unexplained absences of patients who had seemed to be recovering well, and strange activities in the basement areas of the building that occurred late at night when most staff members had finished their duties. Her concerns were vague and difficult to substantiate, but her obvious sincerity and distress suggested that she had witnessed something that contradicted the sanitarium's benevolent public image. The financial operations of Thornfield Sanitarium were handled entirely by the Wilson family, with no outside accounting or oversight that might have revealed irregularities in their business practices. Patients paid substantial fees in advance, typically covering 6 months to a year of treatment, and families were encouraged to provide additional funds for specialized procedures or extended care that might be required. The sanitarium's reputation for success attracted wealthy patients who could afford premium rates, generating income that supported the facility's expensive equipment and high standard of living for the Wilson family. Dr. Wilson maintained extensive correspondence with physicians throughout New England and beyond, exchanging information about difficult cases and innovative treatment approaches that might benefit their mutual patients. These letters, which he proudly showed me during my inspection, demonstrated his connections to the broader medical community and his commitment to staying current with advances in medical science. The letters seemed authentic and professional, providing strong evidence of his legitimate standing among respected physicians. The daily routine at Thornfield Sanitarium followed a carefully structured schedule that balanced medical treatment with recreational activities and social interaction among patients. Mornings began with individual medical examinations and therapeutic procedures, followed by communal meals and supervised exercise appropriate to each patient's physical condition. Afternoons were devoted to educational activities, crafts, and outdoor recreation when weather permitted. Evenings featured quiet activities like reading, music, and conversation that promoted mental stimulation and emotional healing. This structured environment appeared to benefit the patients I observed during my visit, most of whom seemed to be making progress toward recovery under the Wilson family's care. They spoke positively about their treatment and expressed gratitude for the attention and compassion they received from the medical staff. Several patients specifically praised Dr. Wilson's innovative approaches to their conditions and credited him with providing hope when conventional medicine had failed them completely. The medication protocols used at Thornfield Sanitarium combined traditional remedies with experimental compounds that Dr. Wilson claimed to have developed through his own research. The pharmacy was well stocked with both common medicines and exotic substances that required special handling and precise dosing. Thomas Wilson supervised the preparation and administration of all medications, maintaining detailed records of dosages and patient responses that would allow for adjustments based on individual needs and treatment progress. The sanitarium's library contained an impressive collection of medical texts, scientific journals, and general literature that provided intellectual stimulation for patients and staff alike. Dr. Wilson encouraged reading as part of the therapeutic process, believing that mental engagement promoted overall healing and helped patients maintain connections to the broader world during their recovery. The library also served as a social space where patients could interact informally and support each other through difficult periods of treatment. Despite the apparent excellence of the care provided at Thornfield Sanitarium, I began to develop nagging doubts about certain aspects of the operation that I could not easily dismiss or explain. The absence of long-term patients who could provide first-hand testimony about extended treatment outcomes was particularly troubling, as was the remarkably low failure rate claimed by the Wilson family for their innovative therapeutic approaches. Most disturbing of all was the growing realization that my official inspection was being carefully managed to show me only what the Wilson family wanted me to see, while keeping me away from areas and activities that might have revealed the true nature of their medical practice. As my investigation continued into its second week, I found myself questioning not only the legitimacy of Thornfield Sanitarium's operations, but also my own ability to uncover the truth about what was really happening behind the carefully maintained facade of medical excellence and compassionate care. The night of November 11th, 1867, began like any other evening at Thornfield Sanitarium, with patients settling into their rooms after dinner and the staff completing their final rounds before retiring for the night. I had spent the day reviewing patient files in the administrative office, noting discrepancies in treatment records that seemed minor individually but formed a disturbing pattern when examined collectively. The Wilson family had been gracious hosts throughout my inspection, but I sensed an increasing tension in their manner as my questions became more specific and probing. Around 10 o'clock that evening, I was reviewing correspondence in my guest room on the second floor when I heard unusual sounds coming from somewhere below. The noises were muffled and difficult to identify, but they seemed to involve heavy objects being moved and what sounded like multiple people working together on some urgent task. The sounds continued for nearly an hour, punctuated by brief periods of silence that were somehow more unsettling than the activity itself. My curiosity finally overcame my reluctance to appear suspicious, and I decided to investigate the source of these mysterious nighttime activities. I dressed quietly and made my way downstairs, avoiding the creaking floorboards that might announce my presence to anyone who was trying to work undetected. The main floor of the sanitarium was dimly lit by gas lamps turned low for the night, casting long shadows that made familiar spaces seem strange and threatening. The sounds appeared to be coming from the basement level, accessed through a heavy wooden door near the kitchen that I had noticed during my daytime tours but had never seen opened. Tonight, however, the door stood slightly ajar, with a faint light visible through the gap and the continuing sounds of activity emanating from the space beyond. I approached carefully, pressing my ear to the opening to better understand what was happening in the basement. What I heard chilled me to the bone. The sounds were not those of medical procedures or routine maintenance work, but rather the systematic dismantling of something large and organic. I could hear the wet sounds of cutting and the scraping of metal tools against hard surfaces, accompanied by quiet conversations between people who were obviously trying to avoid detection. The voices belonged to the Wilson family members, though their words were too muffled for me to understand the specific content of their discussion. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open slightly wider and peered into the basement corridor. The space was lit by several oil lamps that created dancing shadows on stone walls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Air carried a smell that I initially could not identify, but that triggered an instinctive revulsion that made my stomach clench with primitive fear. It was organic and metallic, sweet and corrupt, the smell of death and decay that no amount of cleaning could completely eliminate. I could see Thomas Wilson working at a large wooden table, his sleeves rolled up and his hands busy with tools that gleamed in the lamplight. Catherine Wilson stood nearby, holding a lamp steady while occasionally handing him instruments from a leather case that contained items I could not clearly identify from my position. Dr. Wilson himself was supervising the work, giving quiet instructions while consulting what appeared to be anatomical diagrams spread across a smaller table. The full horror of what I was witnessing did not become clear until Thomas Wilson stepped aside to reach for a different tool, giving me an unobstructed view of the table where he had been working. The form lying there was unmistakably human. though it had been systematically dismantled in a way that suggested both medical knowledge and complete disregard for human dignity. What remained was being processed with the efficiency of a slaughterhouse, reduced to components that could be easily disposed of or repurposed. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing, to reconcile the horror before me with the respectable medical facility I had been inspecting for nearly 2 weeks. The Wilson family, who had presented themselves as dedicated healers committed to saving lives that conventional medicine had abandoned, were engaged in activities that could only be described as butchery conducted with surgical precision. The patient whose remains lay on that table had trusted them with his life, and they had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. I must have made some sound of shock or revulsion, because Catherine Wilson suddenly looked up in my direction. Our eyes met through the partially open door, and I saw recognition and calculation flash across her face in the span of a heartbeat. She said something to her father and brother that I could not hear, but their immediate response told me that my presence had been discovered and that I was now in considerable danger. I turned and fled back toward the main staircase, my heart pounding with terror and my mind racing to understand the full implications of what I had witnessed. The Wilson family was not running a legitimate medical facility, but rather some kind of systematic murder operation disguised as a sanitarium. The patients who arrived seeking healing were being killed and dismembered, their bodies disposed of in ways that left no trace of their fate. The testimonials and forwarding addresses were fabrications designed to satisfy inquiring family members and prevent investigation into the disappearances. Behind me, I could hear the Wilson family moving quickly through the basement, extinguishing lamps and securing evidence of their activities. They spoke in urgent whispers that carried up the stairwell, though I could not make out individual words. The tone of their conversation made it clear that they were discussing how to handle my unwelcome discovery and what steps they needed to take to protect their operation from exposure. I reached my room and immediately began gathering my belongings, knowing that I needed to leave Thornfield Sanitarium as quickly as possible. The Wilson family would not allow me to depart with knowledge that could destroy them, and I had no illusions about their willingness to add another victim to their collection if necessary. My only advantage was that they might hesitate to act. Immediately, unsure of how much I had actually seen or understood, as I packed my papers and personal effects, I could hear movement in the corridors outside my room. Footsteps moved quietly but purposefully through the building, suggesting that the Wilson family was conducting some kind of search or taking precautionary measures to secure potential evidence. I heard doors opening and closing throughout the sanitarium, accompanied by muffled conversations that indicated systematic activity rather than random movement. The realization struck me that the other patients in the building were in immediate danger, possibly scheduled for the same fate I had witnessed being inflicted on the victim in the basement. These people, who had come to Thornfield Sanitarium seeking healing and hope, were trapped in a death trap operated by a family of medical murderers who had perfected their methods over more than 3 decades of operation. I had a moral obligation to warn them, but I also knew that any attempt to alert other patients would immediately reveal my location to the Wilson family. I decided that my only option was to escape the sanitarium and alert the authorities in Millbrook, hoping that the local sheriff would have the courage and resources to confront the Wilson family before they could eliminate the evidence and disappear. The nearest law enforcement was more than 5 miles away through dense forest, but I had no choice except to attempt the journey on foot through the darkness and hope that I could reach help before the Wilson family realized I had fled. Back staircase that led to the kitchen offered the best chance for an undetected exit, as it was located at the opposite end of the building from the main entrance where the Wilson family would expect me to appear. I made my way downstairs carefully, avoiding the areas where I could hear continuing activity and staying in the shadows that provided concealment from anyone who might be watching for movement. The kitchen was empty when I reached it, though. I could see light coming from the direction of the basement door and could hear the sounds of ongoing work below. The Wilson family was obviously engaged in cleaning up the evidence of their activities, probably disposing of remains and sanitizing the workspace where they conducted their murderous operations. The efficiency of their actions suggested long practice and systematic procedures developed over years of similar incidents. I reached the back door and found it unlocked, apparently left unsecured during the Wilson family's nighttime activities. The November air was bitter cold, and snow had begun falling while I was inside, creating a white covering that would make tracking my movements much easier for anyone who decided to pursue me. I had no winter clothing appropriate for a 5-mile trek through forest paths, but I had no choice except to attempt the journey and hope that I could reach safety before succumbing to exposure. The path that led from Thornfield Sanitarium toward Millbrook was barely visible in the darkness and falling snow, winding through pine forest that seemed to close in around me with each step. I had walked this route several times during daylight hours, but navigating it at night proved far more difficult than I had anticipated. The familiar landmarks that had guided me during previous walks were invisible in the darkness, and the snow was already beginning to obscure the path itself. Behind me, I could see lights moving through the sanitarium building as the Wilson family continued their activities. Occasionally, I glimpsed figures silhouetted against windows, and once I thought I saw someone emerge from the building and look in my direction. I could not be certain whether they had discovered my absence yet, but I knew that my escape would not remain undetected for long. As I struggled through the deepening snow, my mind was overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I had discovered at Thornfield Sanitarium. 82 bodies. Dr. Wilson had mentioned that number during one of our conversations, referring to the total number of patients who had been successfully treated and relocated over the years. At the time, I had interpreted this as evidence of the sanitarium's success rate, but now I understood that it represented the scope of the Wilson family's murderous activities. 82 people had arrived at Thornfield Sanitarium seeking medical treatment and had instead been systematically murdered by a family that had built their fortune and reputation on the trust of desperate patients and grieving families. The scale of the deception was staggering, involving forged credentials, fabricated testimonials, and an elaborate infrastructure designed to conceal mass murder behind the facade of medical innovation. The forest seemed endless as I stumbled through snow that was now ankle-deep and continuing to fall steadily. My feet were numb with cold, and my hands had lost most of their feeling despite being buried deep in my coat pockets. The path became increasingly difficult to follow, and several times I found myself lost among trees that all looked identical in the darkness and swirling snow. I began to hear sounds behind me that suggested pursuit, though I could not be certain whether they represented actual danger or simply my imagination heightened by fear and exhaustion. The wind carried sounds that might have been voices calling my name, and once I thought I saw a light moving through the trees at a distance that suggested someone was following my trail. The Wilson family would have no difficulty tracking my movements through the fresh snow, and they possessed the advantage of knowing the forest paths better than I did. The cold was becoming a serious threat to my survival, sapping my strength and making coherent thought increasingly difficult. I knew that I needed to find shelter or reach the town before hypothermia rendered me helpless. But the distance to Millbrook seemed impossibly far, and the forest path continued to be obscured by falling snow. My legs felt heavy and unresponsive, and I stumbled frequently over obstacles that I could not see in the darkness. After what felt like hours of struggling through the forest, I finally saw lights ahead that indicated I was approaching the outskirts of Millbrook. The sight of civilization gave me renewed strength, and I pushed forward through the snow with desperate determination. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit had faded, suggesting either that I had successfully evaded my followers or that they had decided the risk of being seen in town was too great to continue chasing me. I reached the first houses on the edge of Millbrook as dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, though the continuing snowfall made visibility poor, even in daylight. My appearance must have been alarming, as the first person I encountered immediately offered assistance and shelter. I was barely coherent from cold and exhaustion, but I managed to communicate that I needed to speak with the sheriff about urgent criminal activities at Thornfield Sanitarium. The sheriff, when he finally arrived, was a practical man who had dealt with various emergencies throughout his career, but had never encountered anything approaching the scale of horror I described. He listened to my account with growing skepticism, clearly finding it difficult to believe that the respected Wilson family could be involved in systematic murder disguised as medical treatment. However, my physical condition and obvious terror convinced him that something serious had occurred, and he agreed to investigate my claims. As we organized a group of deputies and concerned citizens to return to Thornfield Sanitarium, I wondered whether we would find any evidence of the activities I had witnessed or whether the Wilson family had used the intervening hours to eliminate all traces of their crimes. The systematic efficiency I had observed in their nighttime operation suggested that they had contingency plans for exactly this type of emergency, and I feared that we might arrive to find nothing more than an empty building and vanished suspects. The return journey to Thornfield Sanitarium took place in full daylight, but continued snowfall that had transformed the landscape into an alien environment where familiar landmarks were difficult to recognize. The building appeared peaceful and normal from the outside, with smoke rising from chimneys and no signs of unusual activity. However, as we approached the main entrance, I noticed that several windows that had been lit during my previous visits were now dark, and the usual sounds of daily activity were absent. The front door stood unlocked, swinging open at our approach to reveal an interior that had been systematically emptied of both people and evidence. The Wilson family had vanished during the night, taking with them any materials that might have confirmed my account of their murderous activities. The patients who had been residents of the sanitarium were gone as well, leaving behind only empty rooms and personal belongings that testified to their recent presence. The basement laboratory where I had witnessed the dismemberment was spotlessly clean, with no trace of the blood and remains that had horrified me just hours earlier. The Wilson family had obviously spent considerable time and effort erasing all evidence of their crimes, leaving investigators with nothing concrete to support the serious accusations I was making against respected members of the community. However, their cleanup efforts had not been completely successful, and a thorough search of the premises revealed evidence that would ultimately confirm the full extent of their horrifying activities. The discovery that would expose the truth about Thornfield Sanitarium lay hidden beneath floorboards that concealed the remains of 82 victims, whose families had never learned their true fate. The search of Thornfield Sanitarium began at sunrise on November 13, 1867, with Sheriff Benjamin Crawford leading a team of 6 deputies and 12 volunteers from Millbrook, who had been shocked by my account of what I had witnessed in the basement laboratory. Despite the Wilson family's obvious efforts to eliminate evidence of their crimes, I remained convinced that a facility used for systematic murder over 3 decades would contain traces that even the most thorough cleanup could not completely erase. Sheriff Crawford was a methodical man who understood that extraordinary accusations required extraordinary proof, and he organized the search with the systematic approach of someone who knew that any evidence we discovered would face intense scrutiny in court. We began with the main floor of the building, documenting the layout and examining every room for signs of recent activity or unusual modifications that might support my claims about the sanitarium's true purpose. The administrative office yielded the first significant discovery when Deputy Marshal Thomas Hayes noticed that several filing cabinets appeared to have been recently emptied, with scattered papers on the floor suggesting hasty packing. Among these documents We found fragments of correspondence that contradicted the Wilson family's claims about patient outcomes and recovery rates. One partially burned letter mentioned payment, arrangements for specimen disposal, and referenced a contact in Boston who could handle organic materials without questions. The kitchen area revealed evidence of unusual food preparation activities that went far beyond normal meal service for sanitarium patients. Martha Collins, the head cook, had apparently been complicit in the Wilson family's operations, as we discovered specialized cutting tools and preservation equipment that would have been unnecessary for legitimate culinary purposes, hidden behind sacks of flour. We found detailed records of special meals prepared for family members during nighttime hours, with ingredients listed that were clearly not intended for human consumption. The patient rooms on the second and third floors told a more disturbing story than the sanitarium's public areas. While most appeared normal at first glance, careful examination revealed modifications that suggested they had been designed as much for containment as for comfort. Several rooms had reinforced door frames and window bars that could be locked from the outside, preventing patients from leaving even if they became suspicious about their treatment. We found hidden compartments containing restraint devices and sedative medications in quantities that far exceeded any legitimate medical need. Sarah Bennett, the young assistant nurse who had been the only staff member to remain at the sanitarium during the Wilson family's hasty departure, provided crucial testimony about activities she had witnessed but had been too frightened to report. She described nighttime procedures that took place in the basement laboratory, patients who disappeared suddenly after showing signs of recovery, and conversations she had overheard between family members about processing schedules and disposal requirements. According to Sarah's account, the Wilson family had developed a systematic approach to their murderous activities that minimized risk while maximizing profit from each victim. Patients were carefully selected based on their financial resources and the likelihood that their disappearance would prompt extensive investigation. Wealthy individuals with distant family members were preferred targets, as their absence could be explained through fabricated testimonials about successful treatment and relocation to Western territories. The basement laboratory proved to be the heart of the Wilson family's operation, despite their efforts to clean the space thoroughly before fleeing. Sheriff Crawford brought in Dr. William Morrison from Portland, an experienced physician who could interpret the medical equipment and chemical supplies that remained in the facility. Dr. Morrison's examination revealed that the laboratory contained surgical instruments and pharmaceutical compounds far beyond what would be needed for legitimate medical treatment. Most damning was the discovery of a hidden chamber beneath the laboratory floor, accessed through a concealed trapdoor that had been carefully camouflaged to appear as part of the stone foundation. This underground space contained evidence that the Wilson family's crimes extended far beyond what I had witnessed during my terrifying encounter on November 11th. The chamber served as both a storage area for bodies awaiting processing and a disposal site for remains that could not be completely eliminated through other means. The hidden chamber contained the skeletal remains of dozens of victims, carefully arranged and cataloged in a manner that suggested the Wilson family had maintained detailed records of their murderous activities. Each set of remains was accompanied by a metal tag bearing a number and date, creating a systematic inventory of death that spanned more than 30 years of operation. The earliest dates we could decipher went back to 1835, just 1 year after Dr. Wilson had established Thornfield Sanitarium. Dr. Morrison's examination of the remains revealed evidence of both natural death from illness and deliberate killing, through various methods that demonstrated medical knowledge and surgical skill. Some victims appeared to have died from poison administered in carefully calculated doses, while others showed signs of surgical procedures that had been performed without regard for patient survival. The variety of killing methods suggested that the Wilson family had experimented with different approaches to determine the most efficient and undetectable ways to murder their patients. Among the documented remains, we found evidence that corroborated my estimate of 82 total victims, though the actual number may have been higher due to remains that had been completely destroyed or disposed of elsewhere. The systematic nature of the record-keeping indicated that the Wilson family had treated their murderous activities as a business enterprise, maintaining inventory controls and documentation that would have been admirable in legitimate commercial operations. The financial records we discovered in Dr. Wilson's private safe revealed the economic motivation behind the sanitarium's criminal activities. Patient fees had generated substantial wealth for the Wilson family over 3 decades, with individual payments often exceeding the annual income of skilled workers in Millbrook. The family had invested this blood money in legitimate businesses throughout Maine and Massachusetts, creating a financial empire built on the systematic murder of desperate people seeking medical treatment. Correspondence found hidden in Margaret Wilson's personal belongings revealed connections to a network of similar operations throughout New England, suggesting that Thornfield Sanitarium was part of a larger criminal enterprise that exploited the lack of regulation and oversight in the medical profession. Letters referenced associated facilities in Vermont and New Hampshire where difficult cases could be transferred if local operations became too risky or if patients' families began asking uncomfortable questions. The investigation expanded beyond Thornfield Sanitarium as we followed leads that pointed to the Wilson family's connections with other suspicious medical facilities and their relationships with suppliers who provided materials for their murderous activities. A Boston chemical company had been providing unusual quantities of preservative compounds and disposal acids to the sanitarium, while a medical supply firm had shipped surgical instruments and pharmaceutical preparations that exceeded any legitimate need for patient care. Thomas Wilson's correspondence with physicians throughout the region revealed his efforts to establish referral relationships that would direct vulnerable patients to Thornfield Sanitarium. He had cultivated a reputation as a specialist in hopeless cases, encouraging other doctors to send him patients who had exhausted conventional treatment options. These referrals provided a steady stream of victims whose disappearance could be explained as the result of their underlying medical conditions rather than deliberate murder. The search for the Wilson family themselves proved more challenging than documenting their crimes, as they had obviously prepared escape plans that allowed them to disappear quickly when their operation was threatened. Sheriff Crawford organized a manhunt that extended throughout Maine and into neighboring states, but the family's wealth and connections provided them with resources that made capture difficult. They had apparently maintained safe houses and false identities that allowed them to vanish into the general population. Catherine Wilson was the first family member to be located, apprehended in Boston while attempting to board a ship bound for England. Her capture led to information about her father and brother's whereabouts, though both Dr. Wilson and Thomas Wilson managed to avoid arrest for several additional weeks. Young Edmund Jr. was found in New York City, living under an assumed name and attempting to gain admission to a legitimate medical school using forged credentials. The trials that followed the Wilson family's eventual capture became a sensation throughout New England, drawing newspaper coverage and public attention that exposed the vulnerability of patients seeking medical treatment from unregulated practitioners. The evidence we had discovered at Thornfield Sanitarium provided overwhelming proof of guilt, but the legal proceedings revealed additional details about the family's methods and motivations that had not been apparent during our initial investigation. Dr. Wilson's testimony during his trial provided the most complete account of how the sanitarium operation had evolved from legitimate medical practice into systematic murder. According to his confession, the first patient death had been accidental, resulting from an experimental treatment that had unexpected fatal consequences. However, the family had discovered that the patient's death could be concealed through false documentation, and fabricated communications with distant relatives. The financial benefits of patient deaths had gradually corrupted the Wilson family's medical practice, as they realized that murdered patients generated more profit than recovered ones who might eventually leave the sanitarium and stop paying fees. Over time, they had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for selecting victims, killing them without detection, and disposing of remains while maintaining the facade of a successful medical facility. Margaret Wilson's role in the operation had been crucial to its success, as her management of daily activities and patient records had created the administrative framework that concealed systematic murder behind routine medical care. Her testimony revealed the psychological transformation that had allowed a presumably normal woman to become complicit in mass murder, describing how financial pressures and family loyalty had gradually overwhelmed her moral objections to her husband's increasingly criminal activities. The impact of the Thornfield Sanitarium revelations extended far beyond the Wilson family's prosecution, leading to investigations of other medical facilities throughout New England and the establishment of new regulations governing the operation of private sanitariums and hospitals. The case demonstrated the need for government oversight of medical practice and patient protection measures that could prevent similar criminal enterprises from exploiting vulnerable people seeking treatment for serious illnesses. The final accounting of victims took months to complete, as investigators worked to identify remains and match them with missing persons reports from throughout the region. Families who had spent years wondering about the fate of relatives who had entered Thornfield Sanitarium finally learned the horrible truth about their loved ones' deaths, while the Wilson family faced justice for crimes that had destroyed dozens of lives and shattered the trust between patients and medical practitioners. Throughout New England, the Wilson family met their fate in the spring of 1868, when Dr. Edmund Wilson and his son Thomas were executed by hanging in the courtyard of the Maine State Prison. Margaret Wilson received a life sentence due to her cooperation with authorities, while Catherine Wilson died in her cell before trial, apparently from poison she had concealed on her person since capture. Young Edmund Jr. was committed to an asylum for the criminally insane, where he remained until his death in 1891. The trials had revealed the full scope of their operation, but the psychological impact on the survivors and community members lasted far longer than the legal proceedings. Sarah Bennett, the brave nurse whose testimony had been crucial to the prosecution, never recovered from the trauma of learning she had unknowingly assisted in mass murder. She left Maine permanently and was never heard from again, disappearing into the anonymity of America's growing cities. James Murphy, the groundskeeper who had maintained the killing fields disguised as gardens, confessed during the trials that he had known about the bodies buried throughout the property but had been too terrified to speak. The dark, fertile soil that had troubled me during my inspection had been enriched by human remains for over 30 years. Murphy spent his remaining years in prison, dying of consumption in 1875 while still serving his sentence for complicity in the murders. The Thornfield Sanitarium building itself was burned to the ground by angry townspeople shortly after the trials concluded, though some claimed the fire started spontaneously on a windless night with no apparent source of ignition. The property remained abandoned for decades, with locals reporting strange lights and sounds that kept potential buyers away. Even today, the site remains empty, marked only by a small granite monument listing the names of the 82 confirmed victims. The Wilson case fundamentally changed medical practice throughout New England, leading to strict licensing requirements and government oversight that made similar criminal enterprises virtually impossible. Medical schools began requiring character references and background investigations for prospective students, while state health departments implemented regular inspections of all medical facilities. However, the most lasting impact was on public trust in medical authority. Families became suspicious of doctors who promised miraculous cures, and patients began demanding second opinions and detailed explanations of proposed treatments. Age of blind faith in medical expertise ended with the revelation that respected physicians could systematically murder their patients while maintaining the facade of compassionate care. I continued my work as a health inspector for another 15 years, but I never encountered anything approaching the horror of Thornfield Sanitarium. The Wilson family had represented a unique convergence of medical knowledge, criminal psychology, and social respectability that allowed them to operate undetected for 3 decades. Their legacy serves as a permanent reminder that evil often wears the mask of authority, and that the most dangerous predators are those who exploit our trust and vulnerability. The question that haunts me still, 30 years after that terrible November night, is how many other Wilson families operated similar enterprises that were never discovered. How many patients seeking healing found only death at the hands of those sworn to do no harm. The 82 bodies beneath Thornfield Sanitarium may represent only a fraction of the victims claimed by medical murderers who understood that desperate people make easy prey. Some secrets die with their keepers, buried as deeply as the bodies they tried to hide. But sometimes, on cold November nights when snow falls heavy on the Maine woods, I remember the sound of cutting tools and whispered conversations, and I wonder what other horrors remain hidden beneath the respectable facades of institutions we trust with our lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.